welcome to both and Crip Materiality with Jessica Cooley. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bilode, and I'm a white woman with short brown hair. Behind me, there is a detail of a work from the collection from the museum by Consuelo Chelo González Amezcua. And it's a work currently on view. I'm curator of programming at the American Folk Art Museum. And I'm joining us today from Queens, New York. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, Delaware, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape peoples past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspective in programs and exhibitions at the museum. As many of you know, AFAM is dedicated to uplifting the work of self-taught and folk artists and across time and place. And next slide, we are thrilled to celebrate the artists of our collection with our current exhibition, Material Witness, Folk and Self-Taught Artists at Work, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until October 29th, along with a concurrent exhibition, What That Quilt Knows About Me. And so Material Witness explores how artists learn with and through material engagement. It's the first in a series of thematic shows, generously supported by a grant by the Henry Luce Foundation. This series of exhibition invites us to admire the museum's rich and diverse collection up close, while presenting an expansive history of American art. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Brooke Wyatt, the creator of this exhibition series. Hi, Brooke, welcome. So as AFAM's Luce assistant curator, she is responsible for researching and showcasing the museum's collection while offering new perspectives. So Brooke and I have imagined a series of online programs that can accompany your curatorial endeavors in the museum's gallery. It's a series of investigations into the collection which expands on Brooke's interpretation of objects and fosters new scholarship. So we've titled this series Both And, in reference to artist and writer Lauren O'Grady, who uses the concept of both and to think in a non-hierarchical and inclusive way. So this concept serves here as a methodological device for thinking beyond the untrained, skilled craft art, amateur fine art divides that have historically marginalized the field of self-taught and folk art. So our intention with this series is to engage critically with the history and the specificity of our collection, uncovering any identity-based tropes or formations that may have circumscribed the reading of objects and their makers. And we're really excited to have with us today Jessica Cooley, and to kick us off this new series with this scholar and curator. Jessica Cooley has a PhD in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's developing a new curatorial methodology called Crip Materiality, to address how ableism affects the understanding and valuation of art objects within museums. So with Jessica, we'll be encouraged to look at the collection through the lens of care, accessibility, access, and disability. And just a quick note on sequencing. Brooke will begin with a few words on the exhibition Material Witness, followed by Jessica, who will provide an overview of the terms used today. Then Brooke and Jessica will be in conversation. I will be using the chat room to share more details about the program, our speakers, and the context for the language and terminology used today. And also we will have a Q&A at the end of the conversation. So please share your question in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also use the chat to ask for any additional information during the talk. And before I turn it over to Brooke and Jessica, I wanted to tell you that closed captioning in English is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And also today's program includes live interpretation in American Sign Language. The interpreters are Kumei Kern and Doug Stringham. And this program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. Many thanks to our colleague, Claudia Matural, who's behind the scene today. And thank you for your support, Claudia, and also to all of you for being here. We're grateful for opportunities like this one to connect online, which will not be possible without you all. I hope you will consider supporting our program through a donation after the conversation. Your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of folk art and self-taught artists. So now I'll hand it over to our guests. Please welcome Brooke and Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde. I'm Brooke Wyatt. As Mathilde said, I'm the loose assistant curator at the American Folk Art Museum. I'm a white woman, 44 years old, with shoulder-length brown hair and glasses. I'm wearing a black shirt today. These days, I'm working as an art historian and curator. And in the past, I've done my training as a painter. I did an MFA in painting. And I also have worked as a community-based mental health therapist in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh. And all of these experiences have certainly informed my work as a curator. So if we could go to the next slide, I'll give a brief overview of the show Material Witness, and we'll get to look at some of the included objects in more detail soon. And there's also going to be a link in the chat where you can access images of all of the works in the show, as well as the exhibition text. All the label text is online as well. So the idea of Material Witness is to explore the raw materials that artists choose to work with, alongside like a deep dive into studio practice and working process, recognizing that artwork is work, it's labor. It involves skills and techniques that are built up over time. And the way that this show sort of flips the script is by considering material engagement as a primary site of that learning, and as a site of reciprocal or relational exchange, so that artists are not thought of as just exerting their will onto passive materials, but as working in collaboration with materials, learning from materials about how they can be used, building up that deep knowledge across time. And the title Material Witness is coming from the idea that the materials are sort of the witness and the teachers to the artistic process. The show is also a chance to rethink our focus on the finished product as the only artwork that's worthy of museum exhibition. So it was an exciting chance to show how in AFAM's collection we have, for example, 3 wood carving sculptures by the artist Charles Butler. We also have Butler's work table and his toolbox with his tools, which he also carved and built himself. So in Material Witness, we show not only the sculptures, but also the work table and the tools and the toolbox. And one of the most exciting things that's come out of, for me, spending time in the space and talking with visitors about this show is the way that the focus on materials encourages us, invites us to hold space for what we don't know and what we can't know, because there are several artists in this show, for example, whose identities are not known. Therefore, we don't know very much about, if anything, about why or how, where, when they made these objects. So a lot of the sort of knowledge that we can access is held within the objects themselves. So that kind of brings us right into the idea of this series of both and, making space for not knowing and allowing, hopefully in that space, that the objects from the museum's collection, that we could start to listen to the questions that they have to pose to us. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. Just to focus on an artwork that is in Material Witness. This artwork is by Yuki Fujioka, and it's a piece of paper, black and purple. It's about 2 inches high and 6 inches long. And Yuki Fujioka has taken scissors and made probably hundreds of very pristine incisions in this paper, causing almost all of it to turn into kind of curly thread-like strips that dangle down from a top bar that the artist has left intact. So the process of making is fascinating in the case of this artist, and he's still alive. So it's possible to know about the way he works and the kinds of scissors he uses and things like that. There's a link in the chat to learn more about this artist, who is living and working in Japan and is autistic. And I thought would be a great moment to sort of launch into our conversation about ways that thinking about disability and representation and materiality and artworks can really enrich our study of the fields of folk and self-taught art, certainly, and also of arts and culture in general. So, okay, I'd like to turn it to Jessica Cooley, who I'm so excited to have with us today. And I think we might exit the slideshow, or we can keep this image here. And Jessica, I just want to say that I've learned so much from working together so far, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of our conversation today.
Yay, thank you, Brooke. This is Jessica speaking. I just wanted to do a quick access check and make sure folks can see the ASL interpreters and access the closed caption. So I'll just wait a moment and put in the chat if you are having any problems with that. Okay. Yes, thank you for letting me know. Well, I'd like to just take a moment and thank the folks who have helped to make this event possible, with particular thanks to Brooke and Mathilde, those behind the scenes, of course, our amazing ASL interpreters. My name is Jessica Cooley. I use she, her pronouns. I am a 41-year-old, lushly enfleshed white woman with brown hair, and I am in my office where there is an open window that is beautifully backlighting me and a really interesting printer. So yay. So I am coming to you from my office at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, the unceded land of the Dakota people. The recent publication here in Minnesota of the Truth Report, an acronym that stands for Towards Recognition and University Tribal Healing, a partnership with the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council and the 11 federally recognized tribes in Minnesota, highlights the ongoing struggle for recognition of Indigenous rights and sovereignty, focusing on the systemic mistreatment of Indigenous peoples by the University of Minnesota. And I encourage you all to read this really groundbreaking report and to support more efforts like this one to take place across North America. And so I think we've placed a link to this report in the chat if you'd like to read it. Last year, I wrapped up an almost 3-year stint working as a guest co-curator with my colleague Anne Fox at the Ford Foundation Gallery on a project called Indisposable. It was an online and in-person collaboration that focused on disability art and activism, featuring more than 30 artists and scholars to address the urgent questions of the moment where COVID-19 pandemic and demands for racial justice intersected. And last year, I also joined the University of Minnesota Twin Cities' Liberal Arts Engagement Hub as the ACLS Emerging Voices Postdoctoral Fellow. And I just want to give a shout out to the great work that the Hub is doing here in the Twin Cities, where they really serve as a model for how to foster and support ethical and reciprocal community-centered engagement. So definitely check them out. So I want to begin with the caveat that I am not an expert in the history and practice of self-taught artists. I am, however, a scholar and curator that for the last 15 years has specialized in ways of thinking about, or the methodologies of, the complex intersections of disability, art, and curatorial practice. I am also a person who identifies with disability, as a traumatic brain injury coupled with depression means that I process at a slower pace. I can sometimes have trouble finding words or remembering names or ideas. Embracing my slowness is a key part of my work as a writer, curator, and scholar who seeks to dismantle oppressive ableist expectations around the correct ways to communicate. So to extrapolate on the work of disability studies scholar Alison Kafer, that's K-A-F-E-R, rather than bend disabled body minds to meet the expectations of normative communication, Crip communication bends those expectations to meet our disabled body minds. So today we're going to begin laying the groundwork for our conversation by introducing some of our key terms, followed by an overview of methods and an introduction to my own work of Crip Materiality. First, I'd like to begin by considering the broad strokes of how we start a conversation about art and disability, which is a consideration synonymous with asking, how do we build a world, a community, a museum, an exhibition, a conversation that is centered around the ethics of care and inclusivity? Such a consideration necessitates our ability to welcome and support new ways of knowing and new ways of being that rely on the skill of unlearning. That is, to successfully unlearn harmful belief structures, we must also harness the skill of being open to creatively relearn through nimbleness, listening, collaboration, and care. To begin a conversation about disability and art, we need to first remain open to this unlearning and to unlearning what we think we know and believe about disability. One of the first ways I'd like to approach this is to practice a disability-centered model of care for all our bodies and minds. So I want to extend an invitation to everyone here to let go of expectations for how we attend and participate in Zoom conversations like this one. While we are not together in an auditorium, this virtual space is still a place that requires care for ourselves and each other. So I invite you to listen to your body minds. So if you need to lie down and close your eyes and just listen to this conversation, or if you need to make lunch and eat, if you need to leave entirely, if you want to dance or stim, if you want to turn your camera off or on or chat or not, I want to invite you to please do what brings you comfort. So I will visually describe most of the images we are talking about today, but if you need to go back for the description or to read a more in-depth description, you can follow the link in the chat to our slide deck that will take you to the slides where alt text descriptions are embedded in the images. There is also a link in the chat to our written comments so that you can access that and follow along that way. For multiple reasons, I will be speaking at a slow pace today. And I hope that this pace will allow you to relax into our words and ideas and allow you time to process at your own speed. So I'm going to start with a brief explanation of terms that we are using today, including ableism and the word crip. So if we can move to the next slide. Ableism is a concept and prejudicial ideology that, put simply, is the belief that disability is inferior and in need of correction or cure. I prefer Talila A. Lewis's working definition of ableism that was created in collaboration with disabled, queer, and BIPOC community because it is both intersectional and inclusive. And I'll read what's on the slide here and Talila's definition. Ableism is, quote, a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This system of oppression leads to people and society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth or living place, health, wellness, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism, close quote. Lewis's definition makes many important moves that are critical to fully understanding the danger and pervasiveness of ableism. First, by calling it a working definition, Lewis foregrounds that ableism is never a fixed set of injustices. In other words, ableism is shifty and it is shifting, insidiously showing up in new ways and thus requiring new tactics for dismantling it. Second, Lewis clearly states that ableism is inherently intersectional, which is to say that discussing disability is always already a conversation about race, gender, sexuality, and class. Lastly, Lewis makes the often overlooked point that one does not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And this is an essential point that emphasizes how race, gender, nationality, and class can cause debility or project disability in a way where folks suffer ableist devaluation and discrimination, even if they do not identify as disabled. And so this point also makes room for more fluid definitions and understandings of disability, which is to say that being disabled can be a flexible state, where on some days your body-mind is different than on other days, and that your status as disabled shifts between time and geographic locations. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Another critical term that we'd like to discuss is the word crip. And on the screen now is a quote from disability activist, author, and scholar Eli Clare, who wrote in 1999, quote, "Queer and cripple are cousins, words to shock, words to infuse with pride and self-love, words to resist internalized hatred, words to help forge a politics," close quote. My use and understanding of the word crip as a noun, adjective, and verb comes out of the activist and academic field of crip theory that's pioneered by, among others, Carrie Sandahl, that's Sandahl, Robert McCruer, Mcruer, and Alison Kafer, Kafer. Here, crip is a mode of analysis or way of thinking and understanding disability that expands what might be considered a too narrow frame of what is or is not traditionally defined as the correct definition of disability, which means that crip theory is more than the study of the lives and histories of people's biological disabilities. Instead, it understands that ableism, which we've just talked about, affects all aspects of existence, far beyond the biological or diagnostic. The word crip, because of its history as a word to inflict harm, is a difficult word to say and to hear. Not all disabled people use or even like to hear the word because of these difficult histories. But it's important to remember that the disability community is not a monolith. In fact, it's quite the opposite. As the CDC has published, 1 in 4 adults in the United States has a disability, meaning that disabled people are one of the largest minority groups. And therefore, just like all the people living in the United States, they are incredibly diverse, hold vastly different beliefs, and live very different lives. Although there are some deeply troubling consistencies between these groups of people that result because of ableist ideology and policy, including that 1 in 4 disabled people do not have consistent access to affordable health care. Disabled people have a much higher rate of poverty. The statistics on disability, incarceration, race, and police violence are particularly devastating. 40% of incarcerated people are disabled. If you are a disabled child in elementary school, you are 400% more likely to be arrested. Black and disabled folks make up somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of police killings. It is in fact because of this incredible diversity of disability alongside the consistent through line of how ableism impacts all people with who are disabled that I find the use of the word crip to be particularly helpful. By using crip as a way to personally identify, as well as a curatorial and scholarly framework, I'm able to highlight that I am not talking or speaking for all disabled people, but that I am, however, talking about the ableist ideologies that impact all disabled people. In other words, crip helps me to signal that I am addressing something in excess of medical diagnostics and biographical histories. Instead, I'm addressing the cultural, political, and ethical implications of ableism. And in terms of my conceptualization of Crip Materiality, this includes the way that ableism has affected even the material and molecular level of art objects themselves. Or to put this another way, we can also think about the use of the word crip as having intentional ties to the academic and activist field of queer theory. Both crip and queer reclaim words that have been used to inflict deep harm and to instead reappropriate or to take them up as banners that politicize and decenter the legal and medical spheres equally harmful pathologizing labels of homosexual and disabled. So in this way, the use of crip invites a liberatory politics and critical practice that is self-made by us and for us. Or as Eli Clare proposed, and I'll just read this again because I think it's so important, quote, queer and cripple are cousins, words to shock, words to infuse with pride and self-love, words to resist internalized hatred, words to help forge a politics. And so we have one last term to think about together. So I'm going to turn it over to the brilliant and wonderful Brooke Wyatt to help us think through the terminology and categorization of self-taught artists.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Claudia, who's changing the slides and covering all things tech today. I am so happy to be here, Jessica, and I'm really excited to share this brief overview with some of the critical issues in the field of self-taught art in particular, because I find just endless reverberations with the critical issues that you've just raised that come along with the way disability is constructed in our world and lived. So I am speaking pretty specifically about self-taught art right now. The American Folk Art Museum has an expanding collection of close to 8,000 objects of both historical folk art and contemporary self-taught art. Having said that, those boundaries in terms of historical and contemporary are not perfectly divided, and the fields of folk art and self-taught art, while they have evolved independently in many ways, there have also been many crossovers. But for our purposes today, I am gonna focus on self-taught art. That is my area of scholarship, and I think that it will help us kind of meet in the middle of these ideas of between art and care and disability in some important ways. So the first thing I'll flag about self-taught art is that we're not just saying art, not just calling these makers artists. There's a qualifier, whether it's self-taught, sometimes it's been outsider, sometimes it's been visionary, vernacular, folk. There's something going on with this shifting terminology that suggests that there is some kind of inside to the mainstream art world and an outside. And as soon as we're talking about boundaries, and then we're talking about inclusion and exclusion, and I think one of the main impetuses for our conversation today is how important I know it is both for myself and for Jessica, thinking through what ethical inclusion means, what that looks like, and what self-taught art and disability studies and the intersection of these fields has to teach art history, museum studies, curatorial practice, and so on. So in this shifting terminology that always seems to accompany self-taught art, there is some kind of an implied or imagined lack, whether it's a lack of formal training, a lack of skill or ability, access to resources, opportunities, which certainly may be the case, and certain stereotypes around lack. So as well as some stereotypes that there's a lack of community, perhaps a lack of lineage, a lack of ways of communicating with other artists or with a broader audience, say. And these operate as stereotypes. Laid on top of that, another layer is that the structural factors that structure our society across lines of race, class, gender, ability, immigration status, and so on, also are operating within these kind of markers of difference, are also operating and in some ways signaled within this field of self-taught art in ways. So we're always already talking about difference, but we're funneling it through the lens of art and art objects. And the really complicated balance, I think, to strike here is how to acknowledge the lived experiences of all artists, their biography and history when we know their identity, but to hold that in check and to not obscure the artworks themselves. This is kind of one proposal for how to address engage with works by self-taught artists, is to look at the work, look deeply, spend time with the work, and allowing, again, those questions to kind of raise out of the work, to allow ourselves to be changed through that interaction, and to try to not to jump to our urge to categorize and define our expectations. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide, please, Claudia. Thank you. We're looking at an artwork by Martin Ramirez that is in Material Witness. And it's a rectangular mixed media collage, 18 inches high by 22 inches wide. In the center of a photograph or a magazine clipping, an image of a large white building with trees and a blue sky in the background has been pasted. And around that image, lines have been drawn, repeating lines. Some are curved, some are more straight. These lines create a sort of portal or window or frame effect around the collaged image in the center. Martin Ramirez's work. So here's an example of a moment where holding in tandem and holding in balance what we can know about Ramirez's life experiences and what we can know and encounter through engagement with his work, highlights some really important issues around boundaries of, I started talking about self-taught art, but boundaries around insiders and outsiders to mainstream culture as well. Ramirez migrated to the United States in around 1925 from Jalisco, Mexico, with the intention of working in the US for a few years to pay off the 50-some acre farm where he was living with his family in Mexico. In circumstances that are somewhat unclear, Ramirez was detained and eventually institutionalized. This happened in 1931 in the California state psychiatric system, where he spent the rest of his life. So the materials that Ramirez used, he sourced those entirely from the hospital milieu. The black kind of crayon pigment that he used to make these repeating lines, for example, he may have mixed together, pencil shavings, broken down kind of pieces of crayons or art or some kind of art supplies, collected paper. He may have mixed these together with saliva to create, a viscosity. He may have used oatmeal to create a paste to do this collage work. So there's a sense that the material, someone has said shoe polish in the chat. I haven't seen that documented, but that's the kind of idea. If he had access to shoe polish in the hospital, which may be doubtful, but because I don't know that he was wearing shoes per se. Just keep in mind that he's sourcing these materials entirely from within the conditions of his incarceration. A trope that often accompanies the stories of self-taught artists, and it's sort of a, blessing and a curse, I guess, is that there's often an art world insider who acts as a liaison and in some way shares the artworks made by a person like Ramirez, who was incarcerated, with the outside world. And in this case, there was a doctor who began supplying Ramirez with papers and some supplies, and also exhibited his work asked the hospital staff to save the work. But again, the curse of this is sort of that Ramirez's agency, autonomy, and voice as an artist easily becomes circumscribed through the voice and actions of the figure of this doctor who speaks for him, if you will, who frames his work, who exhibits it under a certain title. The Art of a Schizophrene was the title of the first exhibit of Ramirez's artwork, for example. And I think what we can put in the chat a link to a really important exhibition that's on view currently in Harlem at the Schoenberg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is marking time, art in the age of mass incarceration. This is curated by Nicole R. Fleetwood. And Fleetwood's work, for me, really resonates in the way that she speaks about, artists who are incarcerated are often included under the umbrella of, quote, outsider artists. And Fleetwood argues that such outsiders are the ultimate insiders, being locked up and having this intimate lived experience of mass incarceration and systemic oppression. So we're also gonna put a link in the chat to some information, definitional information about what is disability justice that you can access. This link is from Sin's Invalid, a performance project of artists with disabilities led by and centering artists of color and queer and gender variant artists. And so just sort of a caveat that we could have a whole other fascinating conversation about how the history of the disability rights movement, deinstitutionalization movement, and disability justice interface with the lives, the careers, the reception history, if you will, of artists with disabilities, and impact our work as curators and scholars. Okay, so after all of this, I will hand the conversation back to Jessica. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Brooke. That was really wonderful to hear all that put into conversation, especially around Ramirez's work. So before we get to the concept of Crip Materiality, we're actually going to kind of unpack and try to do this a little bit quickly, but sort of the key ways that disability and art have often been contextualized. So if we could go to the next slide. And as I've outlined in some of my previous work, really, I think there are three main methodological approaches to thinking about disability and art. So biography: was the artist disabled? Subject matter: is disability represented, and if so, how? And style: does the mode of representation convey disability? So we're going to move through these methodologies by focusing on works that are included in material witness. So if we could have the next slide, please. Or yeah, I think the next slide is, yeah, that's great. Thanks. So we'll begin with biography. And it's one of the most common approaches to thinking about disability in art in relation to the biography and lived experience of the artist. So one might consider some of the following questions. Was this artist disabled? Did that disability affect, influence, or shape the art produced? How have art institutions and scholars contextualized or erased this information from their records and interpretive materials? A biography-based approach is often used in conjunction with what we might call an activist model where disabled artists celebrate the richness and vibrancy of the lived experience of disability through visible likenesses in order to point out, among other things, the often erased histories of artists' disabilities from didactics or the way that art institutions characterize these disabilities not as generative sources of creativity, but merely as medical conditions that the artist was forced to overcome. So this approach acknowledges as well that disabled artists don't simply reflect the worlds in which they live, but rather that through their art, they produce political and cultural change, in addition to revolutionizing ways of making and contextualizing art. And this is particularly true for many contemporary disabled artists. And let's see if we could get the next slide. Right, so this could also be true though for an artist like Martha Ann Honeywell, who was born in 1786 in New York. And on the screen now is Honeywell's silhouette portrait of Robert Wright, a solid black silhouette about 5 inches tall of a man in profile, created from cut paper that is pasted to a cream-colored piece of paper mounted in a marble frame. In the handwritten inscription below the silhouette cutout, we can read, quote, Robert Wright in the 17 years of his age. And then above that, and in a curved line mimicking the curve of the bust of the sitter, another handwritten inscription reads, quote, cut by M. Honeywell with the mouth, close quote. So Honeywell was an artist who was born with shortened limbs and did not have hands or normative feet. And she learned to use her mouth to create intricate cutouts of her sitters. As American Studies scholar Laurel Dean explained in an interview about Honeywell, quote, in 1798, at the age of 12, Martha Ann began to perform her unique disabilities and abilities at the American Museum in downtown Manhattan. This first exhibition launched a lifelong career in art and performance for Honeywell. Soon she transformed her shows to focus primarily on her visual art. So she developed incredible skills in diverse media, paper cutting, wax work, miniature writing, needlework, and cut and paste silhouettes. For the majority of her life, she retained exclusive control over her artistic style, her shows, her artwork, her travel, and her profits, close quote. So there are a lot of different ways we could discuss how a biography-based methodology could work for contextualizing and thinking deeply about Honeywell and the intersection of disability and art, including the history of freak shows, or what disability studies scholar David Hevey, H-E-V-E-Y, calls infrequent, and that's spelled E-N-F-R-E-A-K-M-E-N-T, which is a process whereby specific techniques exaggerate and isolate non-normative characteristics to signify difference. In other words, it is not the person that is in fact a freak, but the process of display that makes the person signify that way. So while many disabled people, especially disabled people of color, were kidnapped, violated, and taken advantage of by businessmen running these types of shows, there are artists and performers like Honeywell who, being barred from most occupations due to their disabilities, were instead able to control their own acts, make their own money, and support themselves through this work. Arguably, in the case of Honeywell, where people would pay money to stare at her while she created these rather extraordinary works, there is a kind of reciprocal stare that is aimed back at the audience by Honeywell herself, who, in order to create these silhouettes, must look intently at her sitters to stare back at them. And ultimately, it is she who holds the purse strings and the power, as it is she as the artist who has control over how it is that her sitters are represented. So, and if you're interested in more reading about this idea of staring and disability power relations, I recommend Rosemarie Garland Thompson's book. It's actually titled Staring. So if we can go to the next slide. So the second methodology is subject matter. This approach asks, is there a depiction of a disabled person? Is disability represented as a negative stereotype or as a nuanced identity? Does that representation reveal something about the time and place that the art was created? Often attention to subject matter seeks to locate cultural, social, and political constructions of disability within the representation itself. And so this approach can be used alongside what we might call maybe a historical model, where art helps us to recognize, examine, and critique the way disability was contextualized at a certain moment in time or place. Considering subject matter also helps to build a historical archive for disabled people whose identity was either erased from the record or was seen as so unwanted or aberrant that it was simply overlooked. So it also establishes a way to think more critically about how disability as an identity is produced and formed over time. That is, disability is not static, but shifts depending on changing cultural values. So in this next slide is a tintype photograph of a blind woman. And I think we might move a little bit quickly through this and looking at time. But Brooke, do you want to jump in and say anything about this piece?
Thanks, Jessica. I mean, yes, there's so much that we could say. I think to keep it short, I'll share something that we've discussed that was fascinating to prepare for this conversation today. I went back to the catalog record in the archive. This tintype lives in AFAM's archives, and the record refers to this as a, quote, rare medical folk art document, end quote. And we were really fascinated to think about how disability is inscribed and signaled and represented when the tintype was when the photograph was made in 1865. And then again, at this moment when the photo enters the museum's collection in 1983, it's classified, presumably because the sitter is identified as a blind woman, it is classified as a medical document. So that's all we can, we'll leave it at that, but the archives.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it's interesting as well, because inscribed on the back is quite a bit about who this woman is. She has a name, a maiden name. She's also listed as a mother. And so it presumably has this kind of rich life, but that then in the records gets reified as a rare medical document. So maybe we'll move on to the next slide. So the third methodology is about representation, the style, and what the late disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers, that's Siebers, called disability aesthetics. And by mode of representation or style, we're referring to like the brushstroke, the composition, the use of line, and the question being, does that style convey disability in perhaps an abstract way, or even maybe a quite tangible way? So for example, Siebers considers the use of broken and disjointed brushstrokes by modern artists like Pablo Picasso as a revaluing of disability, and indeed the expression of a certain attraction to the aesthetics of disability. So Siebers claims, and this is a quote, disability aesthetics embraces beauty that seems by traditional standards to be broken, and yet is not less beautiful, but more so as a result, close quote. And so if we go to the next slide, and so on the screen now is a religious text created in the 1780s that actually Brooke beautifully described. Quote, "These are illuminated pages bound within the protective folds of a Bible, capture in vibrantly inked colors the careful attention that Pennsylvania German families gave to the recording of their faith and heritage. They also carry evidence of Johannes Ernst Spätenberg's distinctive approach to the art form. Finely honed geometric elements outline the folios and repeating borders. A stag gallops across the page, birds perch and seem to sing, and oversized flowers surround musicians blowing horns. In a human moment now preserved, the artist seems to have run out of space while rendering the name of Jakob Schaefer, the book's owner, in elaborate calligraphy." Close quote. So what does this have to do with disability aesthetics? The calligraphy that is used here is called fraktur, and that's spelled F-R-A-K-T-U-R. And fraktur, the word itself, derives from the Latin word for a break and has the same root as the English word fracture. And unlike other types of calligraphy where strokes flow and are continuous, this type of calligraphy is celebrated for its fractured style. That is, the strokes of a single letter are broken and fragmented, and as Siebers might note, the brokenness of the script is deemed more beautiful for its fractures and not less. So that's an example of emotive style or disability aesthetics. So if we get to the next slide. So Crip Materiality. So I'd like to propose Crip Materiality as a fourth methodology, as a way to account for and address the pervasive nature of ableism as something that impacts all things and not just human bodies. Crip Materiality demonstrates that a key to understanding the structural ableism of the art institution is to understand the way that some art objects, specifically objects that due to age or material condition are treated as disposable, unwanted, ugly, or in need of a cure. So treatments that mimic ableist cultural and medical responses to disability itself. Specifically, Crip Materiality focuses on objects that are defined in museum terminology as having inherent vice, which is art that is unintentionally falling apart because it is composed of one or more materials known to degrade, corrode, or cause the object as a whole to disintegrate in a way that cannot be stopped or prevented by conservation science. My theorizing of disability as material noncompliance at a molecular level is most starkly condensed in this concept of inherent vice, a term that attributes a moral judgment of vice that is innate or inherent to an artwork. As outlined by the American Institute for Conservation, inherent vice is an artwork that unintentionally deteriorates due to, quote, intrinsic internal characteristics, including weak construction, poor quality, or unstable materials, close quote. The words of the term itself, inherent vice, code material fragility as moral failure, a form of self-directed transgression. Objects of inherent vice are objects behaving badly. Or to extend disability studies scholar Karen Nakamura, that's Nakamura, theory that, quote, disability is a non-compliant way of being in the world, close quote. The non-compliance of objects of inherent vice and their inability or refusal to show up as museum quality objects mark them as disabled. Thus, under the terms of inherent vice, physical weakness becomes moral failure, which must be either corrected or excluded. These deteriorating objects are treated as if flawed by a dangerous mortality that demands life-sustaining procedures to halt or reverse the decay. Or if the object is truly one of inherent vice, meaning that there is no intervention that will halt material decay, then as art conservator Glenn Wharton notes, the work is, quote, considered effectively dead. They are not exhibited and are archived in museum graveyards solely for research purposes, close quote. Crip Materiality attends to the central question of how to think with, care for, and center unintentionally deteriorating art objects as valuable in their own right, as opposed to expendable or dead. So if we go into the next slide. Cool. So on the screen now is a work by disabled artist Judith Scott. It is untitled. It was created in the 90s. It's about 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. It is photographed here in a shallow rectangular cart, likely in the storage area. And it's made of yarn and string that's been wrapped and rewrapped. And the predominant colors, I'd say, are beige, white, purple. And important for this conversation, you'll notice at the bottom that some of the yarn has started to unravel and is spilling out on the cart. So I don't know, Brooke, you want to jump in and talk about this?
Sure, I'll try to
yeah,
keep this brief, but when Jessica, in our conversation about this object, I know it made me pause and remember, okay, this is a great example of how to think about this ethical question of inclusion. So what does it mean to care for an object like this one made by Judith Scott, and to exhibit it? What are the kind of quote unquote correct, what's the correct way to show it? Is it what questions about the artist's intention for the way that her artwork is shown are very complicated, but especially if we try to lay a kind of existing paradigm of ideas about what kinds of objects in what sorts of conditions are valuable to be exhibited. So yes, this to do conservation science work on this object is something that the museum will pursue. However, it's a moment to just pause and sit with the questions that Scott's work raises for us in general, which is that there's a lot that we can't know about her work, and we can't, for example, what's inside this, what's been wrapped inside that space of unknowingness. And so I think to just include diverse quote unquote artworks on using the same methodologies as canonical works from the Western canon, for example, in a sort of additive process. Inclusion there makes me think of including within a corral or an enclosure. And I think that what we need instead is inclusion as more like incorporation from the root of corporal, of the body, in the sense that the objects in the museum there can teach us, and most importantly, fundamentally transform us and museum practices at a deep structural level. I wonder if, so that we can leave a little bit of time for questions, if we could go to the last slide, please, which is which shows a about 7-inch high by almost 5 feet wide drawing by the artist James Castle, showing a blue coat with 4 buttons and 4 buttonholes on a kind of gray background where you can see the lines of the artist's hand. And I also from the opportunity to have this conversation with you, Jessica, I just wanted to end with this, with a thought about both and. James Castle was deaf. We could put a link in the chat, please, to the James Castle House and Archive. And his work has, like many people, fascinated me. And I've written about it, researched it, and I think that scholars and lovers of modern and contemporary art have embraced his work for the ways that he depicted the world around him and the kind of formal innovations that he made. And through my research for this program today, I started spending time with the work of deaf studies and disability studies scholar Brenda Brueggemann, who curated of Castle's work. And we could also put a link in the chat, please, to a 20-minute video that talks about how this exhibit, which was called Constructing James Castle, one focus is his time at a school for the deaf and blind, 5 years that he spent there. And Brueggemann, as a deaf person, looks at Castle's work and sees the deaf school as it was at the time in Idaho when he was there, for example. And so both and here, I'm proposing that we think about how to hold our material and aesthetic and formal and emotional fascination with Castle's work, approaching his work from as artwork and as documentation of his life, and that we also are informed by, in the case of a hearing person like myself, all that I don't know and can't know about deafness and how much, again, so the disability studies has to inform curatorial practice and art history. So that's kind of the both and that I would like to propose to think about for today.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to end. And I wonder, I don't know if there are any sort of quick questions.
Hi, both. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and also exploration of the collection through your expertise and your understanding of disability and the field of disability studies. I think this is really illuminating. We have a few questions and we have a few minutes, so if everyone is okay to go over a little bit the time, let's maybe try to cover a few of them, and we can also try to answer some of the questions that are in the chat individually later. I'm happy to do that later as well, especially Melanie was asking question about accessibility to the exhibition itself, and I think that's maybe something we could address later. And if Melanie, if you hear me, just maybe email us and we will maybe bring that to our maybe the team of the museum itself. But there are a few questions, I think, concerning the concept of disability aesthetics, and one is from Rebecca Elliott, asking about Monet's painting that tracks with this loss of eyesight. And so if we could call his aesthetics also disability aesthetics at the end of his life, and how you will approach his work through this lens. Maybe Jessica, if you want.
Yeah. I think that's a great example of actually many ways in which we can approach disability, right? The biography and the way that that impacts the work, but that the actual aesthetic gestures that result being something that we recognize now as incredibly beautiful, also being an expression of low vision. And so understanding that disability has this incredible generative potential that isn't always marked that way, isn't always called out as being the case. And I think we could also even look at Matisse's cutout series, which is so famous, but part of the reason that even exists is because Matisse, towards the end of his life, due to cancer and different things, was using a wheelchair and had then limited use of his mobility. And so these big, large cutout features are also an example of, I think, this disability aesthetic.
Brooke, would you like to add something? No?
Yeah, no, thanks. Maybe we have time for other questions.
Yes, there's a question from Dominique Kouakalwisi. Do you see a delineation between artists working in themes or chronic illness to be treated differently by institutions than artists with disabilities? So if you want to address this question.
I think in terms of the institutions kind of lag in creating access and creating accessible spaces for artists to engage and to create, that there is a difference. I mean, if we are to fully support artists in their endeavors, there are different support structures we need to put into place. And so having something like paying for an artist's transportation, even, I mean, some like really basic things that would need to happen, that should happen, that I think are starting to happen, but it's been such an effort by disabled artists to make those changes. I mean, artists now have access writers that say, these are the supports I need, and I need you to have them in place. Whereas in the ideal world, the institution itself would already have those support structures in place and to be offered that way. But I'm not sure if that's exactly what the question was, but that's where my brain went with it. I don't know if Brooke, you have.
I just thought right away about how the disability rights movement was focused on rights and legal rights in many ways, and also centered more white people with disabilities and more people with mobility impairments. So disabilities that may like chronic illness or mental health disabilities, a framework like that of disability justice brings all of the different sort of intersectional ways of thinking about disability together, because access doesn't always mean the same thing, and people's needs are different, and so thanks for that.
Someone is also asking if you have any recommendation for writing on on the condition of being institutionalized, isolated, and imprisoned, and how can that inform the practice? I don't know if you have any recommendations that you would like. You can also add to the chat. And I think more generally, I think, and we can end on that question that I had for you. You know, if we think about the collection, the AFAM's collection in general, we know that most of the profiles of the artists in our collection vary dramatically from canonical standards. The materials they use are fragile and they don't meet museum quality standards. And so if we think about your concept of Crip materiality, Jessica, I thought maybe we could consider our collection as a Crip collection. And I would love for you maybe to consider that in relation to our collection, but also what will this redefinition change our approach and our understanding of the objects within it. So maybe we can, if you can answer that.
Yeah, I love that question in part because I think we can think about all collections as Crip collections, right? If we take these lenses or methodologies that we just laid out today, because disability is everywhere. If it's not disabled people, disabled aesthetics, and then, right, like the objects themselves, which because of Crip materiality, we can think about in terms of disability. But I do think, you know, the American Folk Art Museum is such an incredible source of thinking around disability in all of these different ways that I love to think about it as also kind of like, this is our Crip museum. This is a place where we can go and think really deeply though about disability and have conversations like this and hopefully create a discourse that does not, however, kind of reify the disabled experience into something that is exceptional or visionary. I mean, of course, visionary means so many things, but I think sometimes those words overlay this idea that like disabled people creating art is an exception, where in fact it's the norm. And if we think about it in that way, then AFAM is really a great place to do this kind of work.